This is part 12 of my 7.5-inch gauge Holmside Locomotive build and covers work completed in August 2025. August was a busy month on the Holmside Locomotive. Work continued machining the axle boxes and rebuilding the chassis. I have included 2 videos in this update. The first follows machining of an axle box. The second is a time-lapse of the chassis being rebuilt. The first step in machining the axle boxes was to face the casting to make it parallel. A 2-inch indexable face mill came in handy for this. Next, the casting was cut in half. I have a metal cutting chop saw that goes through cast iron quite easily. The slots were then milled that hold the axle boxes into the horn blocks and allow them to move up and down. Next, the slot for the axle keep was machined to dimension. We had machined the axle keep separately and do not have video of the machining process. The holes were then drilled for the pins that hold the axle keep in the axle box and the pin that holds the spring pins in place. A clamp was used to hold the axle keep into the axle box during drilling. Next, the slots that the spring pins locate in were machined in the axle keeps. This required removing the axle keeps from the axle boxes and setting them up in the machine vise by themselves. The axle boxes and keeps were then reassembled with the spring pins inserted. In the video you can see the pins and spring pins. The assembly was then bored to provide a surface to dial in the axle box assembly on the lathe. Using the lathe speeded up the boring process significantly. The axle boxes were then centered in a 4-jaw chuck on the lathe and bored out to the correct size for the axles. The axles are a 2-tool steel and have a finished diameter of 1.14 inches. Here's a photo of a finished axle box assembly. There's one more machining job to complete on the axle boxes. Slots for the felt oil pads need machining in the axle keeps. This will be done later in the project. This next sequence shows the axle boxes being installed in the frames. The first step was to number punch the axle box, axle keep, and horn block to identify their positions. The photo shows the driving axle boxes installed in the frames. The horn stays were then bolted onto the horn blocks. The stays are a tight fit over the horn blocks and needed care to ensure they were installed correctly before tightening the bolts. Next, the springs were installed over the spring pins, as shown in the photo. I made step washers to go over the springs so that they center on the spring pins. The photo shows the step washers installed on the springs. Finally, the nuts were installed to tension the springs. I made the nuts from hex bar as they needed to be threaded 1/4 inch, 40 TPI. Here's a photo of the driving axle boxes with an axle blank test fit into them. The axles will be machined very soon. The same process was used for the leading and trailing axle boxes. This photo shows the leading axle boxes and horn stays installed. This photo shows the leading axle springs, step washers, nuts, and axle blank test fitted into the axle boxes. The pivots for the driving and trailing brake levers were installed in the frames. The leading brake lever needs a redesign due to a drawing issue. This will be dealt with later in the project. The way shaft, on the left of the photo, and the brake shaft, on the right, were installed in the frames. This photo shows the trailing axle assembly installed in the chassis with an axle blank. At this point in the build, the locomotive was starting to get very heavy. I paused the build to put the chassis in octagonal rotisseries. These ease turning the chassis over when I have to work on either side. The eccentrics were machined to drawing and test fit on the driving axle. The chassis was turned over and right-sided, so work could begin assembling the valve gear. In parallel, work started to machine the driving axle. The valve connecting rods were installed on the ends of the valve rods. The suspension levers were then installed and pinned into the valve connecting rods. The piping from the automatic drain valves to the cab area was then installed. The reversing lever mechanism was then bolted to the frame and the reach rod installed between the reversing and way shaft levers. The driving and trailing brake levers were installed on the pivots bolted to the chassis frames. The expansion links were then pinned into the connecting rod fork ends. The newly machined axles were installed in the axle boxes. These had been machined in parallel with building the chassis up. Next, the lifting links were installed. The lifting levers were installed on the way shaft and connected to the lifting links with pins. I will pin the lifting levers to the way shaft later. Here's a close-up shot of the reversing assembly. Work was also started machining the eccentrics and eccentric straps. This photo shows both in various stages of completion. This photo shows one of the eccentric straps in the lathe, ready for boring. The castings for the straps were a lot bigger than the drawings, which required quite a lot of machining to get them to size. August 2025 was a busy month on the project. I progressed rebuilding of the chassis, completed the last set of axle boxes, machined the axles, and worked on the eccentrics and eccentric straps. I had a lot of help from my dad throughout the month. His help speeded up the project no end. There will be more updates on the Holmside build soon. Please like and subscribe to support my channel. Thank you.